Today we're going to talk very briefly about sort of where we are and how we got here, but spend most of our time looking at the kind of decisions that the next mayor will face, because when the ball drops on New Year's and we have a new mayor, they'll be presented with a very costly problem, costly in terms of the hundreds of millions of dollars it takes to run the shelter system, and costly in terms of the thousands of lives that are affected by homelessness. How did we get here? What is driving the crisis today? How is it different from 10, 20 years ago?
My name is Markee. I'm Senior Policy Analyst at Coalition for the Homeless. And for those of you who don't know us, we are the oldest advocacy and direct services organization serving homeless New Yorkers. Our co-founders began working in the late 1970s when modern homelessness first emerged as the crisis that it continues to be this day. And over the last more than 3 decades, we've continued to advocate for long-term solutions to the problem, defend the rights of homeless people, including the landmark victory that we won 30 years ago, establishing a legal right to shelter for homeless New Yorkers, but also other fundamental civil rights for homeless New Yorkers, and continuing to sort of lobby, organize, and call for solutions to this problem. At the same time, our 11 direct services programs serve more than 3,000 homeless and low-income New Yorkers each day. It's everything from feeding homeless people sleeping on the streets every night of the year to permanent housing programs, including permanent supportive housing. There's the old saying that if you don't learn from your mistakes, you're destined to repeat them, and I think that's very much an apt lesson for where we are today in New York City in terms of homelessness, the homelessness crisis, and looking forward to a new mayoral administration and what could be done to change that. So let's talk about how we got where we are. Right now, there are more than 50,000 homeless men, women, and children sleeping each night in the city shelter system, the highest numbers since the city began recording those numbers, the highest number of homeless New Yorkers at any time since the Great Depression in the 1930s. Since Mayor Bloomberg took office back in 2002, we've seen a 61% increase in the homeless shelter population, a 73% increase in the numbers of homeless families sleeping in the shelter system each night. Just in the past year alone, a 20% increase. So clearly things are going in the wrong direction. It would be bad enough to talk about 50,000 homeless people sleeping in shelters each night, including 21,000 children, a startling figure. It's made even worse by the fact that those numbers continue to be on the rise and look to continue to rise in the coming year, absent a change in policy. At the same time as that snapshot of how many people are homeless on a given night is so troubling, let's look at how many people experience homelessness over the course of a year. More than 105,000 different homeless men, women, and children spent at least a night in the city shelter system last year, and that includes around 40,000 children. The New York Post recently published an article saying that according to the broader definition of homelessness that the Education Department uses, in October of last year there were, I think, around 53,000 homeless students, and that includes public school students who are sleeping in shelters, but also people living doubled up in another sort of non-permanent housing arrangement. So we're looking at a crisis of really historic proportions. How did we get here? Obviously, the historic economic crisis that began in 2008 and the recession, the Great Recession and the high unemployment rates that linger to this day are a fundamental part of that problem. We saw similar things happen during the 2001 economic recession, the early 1990s recession, and of course the Reagan recession, the so-called Reagan recession of the early 1980s. People lose jobs, people's incomes drop, many of those folks lose their housing. That's obviously been a big part of the cause. It's one of the reasons that we saw the highest numbers of families entering the shelter system since the city began recording it in the years 2009 and 2010. It was obviously a result of the recession. What else is the other factor? Well, the continuing shortage of affordable rental housing in New York City. During the recession, remarkably in New York City, and this is different from many other cities around the country, rents continued to rise. We saw apartment rents continue to rise even as incomes were falling. In other cities in the country, rents went down or flattened. We saw apartment rents continuing to rise. At the same time, we've seen a significant loss of subsidized housing from a host of different programs, federal and state programs. We've seen, according to a recent study by the Community Service Society, a 7% loss in the subsidized housing stock over the last 20 years at a time when we've seen the population of the city grow and the poverty population of the city grow significantly. So those are the challenges that led us to where we are now. But fundamentally, we also saw major policy mistakes made by the Bloomberg administration. Most significantly, the decision back in 2005 to cut off homeless families from priority access to permanent affordable housing, to federal housing programs, public housing, and Section 8 vouchers, which under previous New York City mayors, from Ed Koch through David Dinkins through Rudy Giuliani, had worked very well to help tens of thousands of families, children, move from shelters into stable, permanent housing and stay there. So since that time, since 2005, what we've seen is an increase in families returning to shelter. Back when the city used to use federal housing programs as its principal tool to rehouse homeless families, around a quarter of all families who entered our shelter system each year were formerly homeless. Last year, 61% of all families who entered the shelter system were formerly homeless, and much of that is because many of those families were families that had left shelter with short-term temporary rent subsidy programs like Housing Stability Plus or Advantage, or who left shelter with no housing assistance whatsoever. And as we know from research and evidence, those families tend to have a much harder time staying in stable housing. So what we saw, unfortunately, was a series of policy mistakes that contributed to the underlying factors, the housing affordability crisis and the economic recession, driving more and more families into homelessness and keeping more families homeless for longer periods of time. And that's been really one of the fundamental kind of causes of where we're at now.
Great, thank you. George, definitely jump in on the history in general, but also if you could talk a little bit about if you've seen in your work changes in not just the volume of people coming through the system, but who is coming through the system demographically, anything about their backgrounds, or if it's just a question of a difference of volume between now and 10 years ago.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us. I'm George Nashak. I'm the Executive Vice President of Help USA and spent a chunk of time at the Department of Homeless Services overseeing the adult shelter system, street homeless solutions, and the rehousing of single homeless adults. There's no question that what we're seeing now is to some extent, or to a large extent, driven by the economic recession. But I do want to, you guys have followed, as I'm sure I've followed, and I'm sure you have as well, you guys have followed the trajectory of this across the country. At the height of the economic crisis, you saw tent cities developing in many places. You saw families with children living in cars, stranded in the street. It's worth remembering that we had none of that in New York City, none of that. There were no families living on the street. Perhaps there's someone who arrived, you know, from a distant location, and until they found out where the entrance to the shelter system was, they needed to be in a car. But we saw none of that because of the robust shelter system that New York City has developed. And I think that that's very important for us to remember, because we do a lot of kind of self-beating about what has happened in the last few years. And we have stepped up to that challenge in a significant way. On top of that, then, the Department of Homeless Services was tasked with also working through a lot of the rehousing and sheltering activities that had to do, that came out of the Hurricane Sandy problem in the fall. And so I think as a city, we've got a lot to be proud of in terms of how strong our response has been. But I also want to point something else out that, that I don't think gets enough attention. In many respects, I think part of what's driving the increase in the shelter census is the fact that we have begun, or for many years have attempted to solve key problems related to poverty and economic opportunity out of the shelter system. It's a wonderful thing that we have a right to shelter in New York City. We should all be very proud of that. It's a very progressive thing that doesn't exist elsewhere in the country. But because there are also unintended consequences to that, and what we have done as a sector to some extent is to burden the DHS shelter system with responsibilities that probably don't belong there. The shelter system should be an emergency response to a housing crisis in an individual or a family's life. And what's ended up happening is that we've attempted to create safe, affordable housing, using the platform of the shelter system. We've attempted to create employment and jobs programs using the platform of the shelter system. And what has ended up happening, and this I think connects a little bit to Jarrett's point, is that we make the shelter system a magnet for people who want to receive certain services that are not necessarily homeless-related services. And so we'll have the opportunity in a little while to talk a little bit about the direction we think we should go in the future. I think it's important as a city, and the next administration needs to take on the question of what are the root causes of homelessness? What are the things that are driving homelessness? Do all of those issues need to be addressed out of the homeless shelter system? We've seen, for example, in New York City, a significant increase in people coming from other jurisdictions and ending up in the homeless shelter system. We have a right, and they have a right, and we have a responsibility to shelter them. I don't begrudge people coming into the shelter system who in fact need it. But what ends up happening is that New York City is seen as a place where there are rich services and resources and entitlements available, and people see the shelter system as being the locus to receive those services. And so I think, of course, the economic recession has caused the increased homelessness. As Patrick points out, the removal of rental assistance hasn't increased the number of people coming into the shelter system, but it has increased the length of time people have stayed there, which in fact also increases the census. But we've also created the situation where DHS has been, I think, unfairly burdened with addressing some of the key core poverty, income inequality issues, and unemployment issues that are endemic to our city that need to be solved elsewhere.
Chris, do you want to respond to that in general, and do you want to respond to the idea that perhaps part of the problem is that we've overburdened our shelter system?
Before I go into what George was talking about, I think there's a couple other things that we can talk about too, just from a federal perspective if you're looking at social policy. A couple of things, just the fact that we haven't really reauthorized support for public housing, and also looking at Section 8, the Section 8 program, which were really the fundamental programs that really help people address the issues of unstable housing. So, from the perspective that I'm, been working on my career, it's exactly as what they're, my two colleagues on the right are saying. It's about poverty and lack of affordable housing, and policy choices that are being made. So I want to just bring in the federal piece of that. So we have those areas around public housing authorities all over the country struggling, and now we have the issue with Section 8, and then we have one other piece that a lot of people don't talk about, which is the Welfare Reform Act of 1996. Really, that put that 5-year time limit on families. So in New York at that time we had about 1 million people on public assistance, and now we have I think it's 300,000. So when we were in the middle of a recession, we didn't see the numbers go up. We saw food stamps go up, but we didn't really see the numbers go up for public assistance. So there's all these other social policy issues, and I think this is what George is getting at, is that there are other social policy issues that intersect with homelessness. One of the things that we often say is that homelessness is the intersection of the failures of all the other systems to take care of the people that are coming out of those systems. So we're talking about probation, parole, nursing homes, assisted living, adult homes, runaway homeless youth, foster care, hospitals, who am I missing? Domestic violence, all the systems that aren't fully resourced or haven't paid attention to the fact that these populations, if their folks are not cared for, are going to feed into the system of homeless services. And frankly, the system is not, DHS has not been resourced enough to deal with those problems. So I think what we have are a lot of policies that were singularly focused on whatever facet of the issue they're working on, and not really working together to look at the broad picture of poverty. Not to mention, the fact that real wages for working people and minimum wage people have not really gone up since the 70s. So you have that other policy piece. And homeless people work. You all know that. They may, I think the average wage in the shelter, DHS is here, they can tell me it's about $9 an hour. We know that, the vacancy rate for extremely affordable apartments, it's 1.5%, I think, and 3% for really affordable apartments. That's the vacancy rate available for the people that are in our shelters. That's almost impossible for them to find it. We know that New Yorkers are rent burdened up to, people are paying more than I think it's 27 or 28% of New Yorkers are paying more than 50% of their rent. All of these factors contribute to how we got to this system.